The wealth of Genoa, the naval might of Venice, the cultural flourishing of Florence, not to mention the enormous power of Rome. In the late 15th century, Italy was home to some of the most incredible minds and societies in human history. Surely, whatever history was about to throw at them, the Italians would seize with both hands and leave their mark as well. Except that isn't quite what happened. After Columbus reached the Americas in 1492, the Italians were conspicuously absent from the list of new colonial powers that emerged to dominate the next few centuries of world history. But why didn't they? In this video, we'll explain why the Italians did not launch their own colonization in the Americas. Italian chaos. First, we need to understand what we mean when we talk about Italy. There was no political entity of Italy in the 15th century. Italian unification wouldn't come until 1871. Most of the peninsula didn't even speak the same language. Modern Italian is descended from Tuscan, spoken around Florence at this time. But there were several other Italian languages too. Italy did not exist in the way that Spain or France already did. The Italian peninsula was instead divided under the control of numerous city-states and lesser powers who had their own interests and agendas. Venice, Florence, Genoa, Milan, and of course Rome, to name just the most powerful. Not only were these individual states smaller and possessed fewer resources than the major colonial powers, they also had a particular problem in the first half of the 16th century that would provide an obvious obstacle to colonization efforts: war. From 1494 to 1559, the Italian city-states were in a near constant state of open warfare and shifting alliances known as the Italian Wars. The Italian Wars dominated the attention and resources of Italy for generations and dragged in the attention of other European nations as well. While Spain was mustering its resources to conquer Mexico and Peru, and Portuguese sailors were making landfall in Brazil, the Italians were consumed with conflict and could not spare the time to worry about staking land claims halfway around the world. Those wars dwindled by the 1550s, but by then, Italy was exhausted. The golden age of the Italian cities was drawing to a close, and the colonial powers had overtaken Italy while it was distracted. The wealth to be gained from Mediterranean trade paled in comparison to the riches of the New World, which allowed Spain, Portugal, France, and England to eclipse them. While the Italian cities remained prosperous, they would never reclaim the position of preeminence that they'd had during the heights of the Italian Renaissance. There were other crises as well. An unusual spike in natural disasters like storms took a serious toll in Italian shipping in the 1520s and 1530s. In 1534, the Venetian Senate had to implement a shipping reform plan to rebuild the navy because they were losing so many ships to natural causes. With war and natural disasters posing a serious threat to Italian naval strength, it's no wonder that foreign colonialism was the last thing on people's minds. Since we started this channel, we have been obsessed with historical maps. Since some of you might like maps as well, we created a few products for you. High-resolution downloads and museum-quality prints. Go to knowledgeia.co and have a look. If you want to own one, use my code in the description below. Now, back to the video. Atlantic ports. One look at a map shows another obvious obstacle to Italians establishing American colonies. All four of the major early colonial powers had Atlantic coastlines to launch their expeditions. Lacking such a geographic position immediately rendered American colonization difficult, if not impossible, for the Italians. Of course, Italian ships could access the Atlantic by traveling around the Iberian Peninsula, but that put them at the mercy of Spain and Portugal, who were not necessarily allies. Spain was belligerent in the Italian wars too, and no Italian city could risk setting up a colony to whom access was controlled by a potentially hostile power. Being Mediterranean powers instead of Atlantic ones also caused other practical issues. The Italian merchant navies were among the best in the world, but their ships were designed to sail in the relatively placid waters of the Mediterranean. The war navies of Venice and Genoa were composed almost entirely of oar-driven galleys with triangular sails that were typically quite long and sat low in the water. Meanwhile, the ships used to cross the Atlantic were radically different. Caravel-type ships that were much shorter than galleys but entirely driven by sails and sat higher in the water were much better suited to the long distances and harsh conditions of the Atlantic. Italian merchant vessels could see a wider variety of designs, but these too were mostly older cog and carrack designs that weren't made for ocean travel. While the Italian states, especially Genoa, would eventually adopt more ocean-worthy vessels, they did not do so until decades after the colonial powers had made them standard. Lack of manpower. But that's only part of the answer. Venice and Genoa had some of the best shipbuilders and shipyards in the world. If they wanted to build new ocean-going ships, they could have done it. However, the fact was that the prospect of colonizing the Americas did not have a major attraction for the leaders of various Italian states for a rather simple reason. They lacked the manpower to even attempt it. Probably the single simplest reason for why the Italians did not launch colonization projects in the New World is that they didn't have the colonists. Italy itself was well populated, but as we know, they were divided between many separate powers who claimed only a small portion of that total. For example, Venice's population in 1520 was around 100,000 people. Even then, the power Italian states wielded over these citizens was limited. They had no standing armies, and it was rare for citizens to be pressed into service unless the city was in direct danger. Most fighting was done by mercenaries, many of which were brought in from elsewhere in Europe, like Germany or Switzerland. Since colonization was fundamentally a military venture, Italian states simply couldn't provide the men for such a project like Spain or England could. To put it in perspective, England had around 2.5 million people in 1520, Spain around 5 million. A serious colonial expedition would have required hundreds, if not thousands of people, numbers that were well within reason for larger nations, but completely beyond the Italians. Naval powers like Venice and Genoa did possess moderate overseas empires of a sort, but this didn't solve the issue either. Venice's Mediterranean colonies were not settler colonies. The cities would owe obedience to Venice in times of war and recognize Venetian trading privileges. But the Venetians were not operating an empire that sought to change or dismantle these societies. At most, Venetian merchants might exercise control over the city's civic government, but even that wasn't common. This was similarly true of Genoa and other Italian cities with territory beyond Italy. The Italians knew how to build commercial empires, but not colonial ones. Tuscany expedition. However, given the wealth to be gained in the New World, surely someone would at least consider an Italian colonization effort. In fact, there was one, but it failed completely. In September 1608, Grand Duke Ferdinando of Tuscany commissioned an Englishman, Robert Thornton, to chart the Brazilian coast. Tuscany's goal was to identify a site for a colony to harvest Brazil wood and other resources to send back to Tuscany, cutting out Tuscany's dependence on Spanish and Portuguese traders for various New World resources. Thornton's expedition was a total success. He made it to the South American coast, where he identified a settlement site in what is today French Guiana. After 10 months, he returns to Tuscany with the good news and apparently a full crew without a single casualty, as well as a few natives who agreed to come along for the voyage, although most died shortly after. Unfortunately, Grand Duke Ferdinando had died in February 1609, and interest in a Tuscan colony in the Americas died with him. His son, Cosimo II, had no interest in such a risky and expensive venture. Thornton did manage to assemble around 100 volunteer settlers, but the new Grand Duke cancelled the plans anyway. It was the first and last time any of the Italian states made any serious effort to establish an American colony. Italians in the New World. That being said, it would be totally wrong to say the Italians were not involved in the colonization of the Americas. They just did it under the flags of other nations. Columbus, of course, was Italian, born in Genoa, but received commission from the Spanish crown for his famous voyage. The namesake of the Americas, Amerigo Vespucci, was from Florence and also had to seek Spanish support for his journeys. England's first ventures into the New World were led by John Cabot, real name Giovanni Caboto, which isn't a particular English name, nor was Giovanni da Verrazzano, who led France's first American expedition. Italians were also indirectly involved in colonization through trade and finance. Genoese bankers contributed funds to Columbus's expedition and helped to bankroll several other American expeditions over the years. Genoa's alliance with Spain also led Madrid to appoint Genoese merchants to manage the port of Panama Viejo, which was a major entrepot for African slaves into Spanish-controlled Central America. Italian merchants played a crucial role in trading goods brought back from the New World, especially in the Mediterranean, where news and goods from the New World first reached North African and Middle Eastern ports on Italian ships. The role Rome played in the colonization of the Americas can't be overstated either. As the center of Catholicism, it was a major influence on how colonization played out, especially in Central and Southern America. The Pope and his officials often advised colonizing powers on how to best spread the faith in new lands, and the Church dispatched agents in the form of missionaries and inquisitors that had a huge impact on indigenous people and new colonists. Overall, the fragmented